The World Bank has a new Nigeria Development Update NDU. We have live guests in our Abuja studios, Mr. CHAUDHURI, Country Director, World Bank of Nigeria, and Marco Hernandez, who is the lead economist at the World Bank of Nigeria. Gentlemen, good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Lots to discuss in your report. Shabam, let me start with you. In your report, you state that Nigeria's economic recovery is moving along, but still lagging behind her peers. I take it that's not a good thing, Shabam.
That's correct. Well, it is good news that the economy is recovering, and to tell the truth, recovering faster than we had anticipated. I think what's not good news, or what's still, I think, signals work to be done, is the fact that, the economy we're projecting now would get back up to maybe 2.4, 2.7%, which is barely above the rate of population growth, which means per capita incomes, which have been declining over the last 5 years, will maybe increase marginally. And compared to Nigeria's peers, other emerging economies, which are growing in the 4 or 5% range, or even other countries in sub-Saharan Africa, which are growing in the mid-threes. So the point we make is that, yes, this is good news, but not a time for complacency.
Thank you so much, Shabam. Marco Hernandez, let me come to you. There's another piece of the report that says faster growth is needed in Nigeria in order to take advantage of opportunities. And improve livelihoods? Can you expand on that? Okay, so let me throw that question to you, Shabam, until we can get Marco on. Faster growth needed in Nigeria to take advantage of opportunities and improve livelihoods. Can you expand on that?
Yes, so basically Nigeria needs, above all, more private investment. There's tremendous potential for the economy. It's a young population, a great natural resource base, but it needs more private investment. And for private investment to be catalyzed, there needs to be basic things like power, like access to foreign exchange, clarity, transport connectivity, and security. And so these are the things that can really help move forward and help Nigeria realize its full potential for growth, which we think can get up to the levels of other emerging market economies and even beyond, to 7%, 8% growth rates. But to do all of that, first and foremost, one needs clarity about the policy framework, and the government has to have the fiscal resources to invest in the critical infrastructure that is needed and to invest in its people.
Great stuff. There's, I think it's slides 7 and 8 here on this report, at least on the 26-page summary, inflation and the exchange rate. I'm guessing that, the pass-through effect of exchange rate through to inflation is being felt by the Nigerian masses. And yeah, there it is. You're saying reducing inflation, enhancing exchange rate management remain a priority. Is this a big priority, Shabam?
Absolutely. I mean, look, it's a priority from two angles. First and foremost, it's a priority because the Nigerian people are feeling the pinch. I mean, if your nominal income was flat or even declining, because we've just gone through a pretty difficult 18 months where many households experience drops in income, first because of the lockdown and second because of the downturn in economic activity. If at the same time, the cost of basic needs, food in particular, has been increasing by about 20, 25%, that hits your bottom line. And then that's a big part of why we're saying that just that fact, the fact that prices have increased in high double digit at a time when incomes have not been growing, has driven millions of people into poverty, meaning that they can no longer afford their basic needs. So that's one reason why tackling inflation is such a priority. The second reason is that it drives up the cost of doing business for firms. And then that in turn spills over into their ability, firms to grow, businesses to grow and create jobs. So inflation hits both households and firms.
Thank you so much. You also talked about federation revenues being impacted by lower net oil proceeds, even though oil prices are at 3-year highs or so. How big of an issue is this for the Nigerian government?
Well, let me just lay out the facts and let you and our viewers decide. I mean, look, the fact is that this is the first time in a long time in Nigeria's history that you have oil prices going up at the same time that the Federation's revenues are going down. Because usually what has been the case, certainly in the last 40 years, was this very tight relationship between what's happening with oil prices and hence with the oil and gas revenues that accrue to the Federation, and therefore what happens with overall Federation revenues. This year, or we're projecting this year and going into 2022, we'll see a break. And the break is happening primarily because of the increasing burden of PMS subsidies. So just to give you a sense, I mean, I think in the budget, Federation revenues were projected to be somewhere in the 13 trillion naira range in 2022. Well, last month, the cost of PMS subsidies was 250 billion naira. If you just multiply that by 12, you're up to 3 trillion naira. So you're looking at, a fifth to a quarter of the Federation's revenues, what could have been the Federation's revenues, actually not being deposited into the Federation account. That's why we're projecting that net oil and gas revenues flowing into the Federation account will decline sharply, and that will have an impact on the overall resources that are available, especially to the federal government, but also to the state and subnationals, local governments.
Excellent stuff. We're going to take a quick break. We're still with Shubham Chaudhuri, Country Director, World Bank Nigeria, and Marco Hernandez, Lead Economist, World Bank, talking about the Nigerian development update from the World Bank. Stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be right back. It's the Arise Exchange and Arise News. Welcome back to the Arise Exchange and Arise News. We're continuing our conversation with representatives from the World Bank. We're discussing the Nigeria Development Update, the latest report from the World Bank. Very extensive, very in-depth. We, of course, have Shubham Chaudhuri, who is the Country Director, World Bank Nigeria. And hopefully we bring in now Marco Hernandez, who's the Lead Economist and for the World Bank for Nigeria. Marco, before we went to break, Shubham was just talking about, multiplying 250 billion naira in subsidies over a full year, approaching 3 trillion. You've got in your report talking about how PMS subsidies, I want to stick there, benefit the rich in Nigeria and also smugglers. The World Bank, I have to say, you've been very consistent on how these need to be removed. But Marco, why is it so difficult? Why are we still talking about this in 2021, about to go into 2022?
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and good evening to all your viewers. What I wanted to highlight first, before going into the question of why this reform has not moved in the past, is to also put it into comparative perspective of what is not being addressed as a result of the PMS subsidy. So Shubham has already highlighted the very high cost of the PMS subsidy. It could be over the next 12 months, up to 3 trillion nairas. Now, if we think about where that money could have gone, and also what is being planned in the budget for 2022, the federal government is planning to spend about 3,000 nairas per person for the whole year on health. And the cost of the PMS subsidy for next year could be as much as 13,000 nairas per person per year. So then the question is this a choice that Nigerians are making? Or is it just because of lack of information about that conscious decision of putting resources on the PMS subsidy instead of critical investment like health, like education, like social protection, or maintenance or construction of new roads that will bring growth and the investment that it needs to create jobs? So in the past, I think that there have been attempts. What we are proposing in the Nigeria Development Update is the need to develop a compact by where this information is not only spread throughout the Nigerian public, but also the choice where these resources could be redirected to much more productive investments.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Marco Hernandez. Shubham, let me come back to you. You've got another section of the report here where you talk about policy reform over oil prices. Can you expatiate on that? Are you saying that, policy reform we should be more dependent on reforming, reformist policies than volatile commodities?
Absolutely. I mean, I think if you look at Nigeria over the last 4 decades, what you see is there have been periods where economic growth has picked up, and as a result, there's been, poverty reduction, but it's largely been associated with oil prices being up, therefore government revenues going up. And as soon as the oil prices have gone down, government revenues have gone down, and economic growth has tended to trend downwards as well. So we think of it as Nigeria sort of being buffeted. It's being on the surface of an ocean, buffeted by the swells. and the swells are what happens to global oil prices. But there's a way of breaking out of that, and in essence for Nigeria to be in charge of its own destiny. And then we give an example of Indonesia, which started off much poorer than Nigeria back in 1970, but somewhere in the 80s just overtook Nigeria. And they're very similar economies. They're oil, natural resource rich, large, ethnically and religiously diverse countries. And yet Indonesia managed to break out of this being buffeted by what happens to global oil prices, largely on the back of certain policy reforms which unleashed the power of private investment and yielded government resources, fiscal resources that could be directed towards building schools, educating the population, providing for primary health care. So we think Nigeria has the same choice, that policies, there are certain policies which we spell out in the report, which would help Nigeria kind of rise up to the potential that it has, and where it's no longer as vulnerable to what happens in global oil prices.
Thank you so much for that, Shubham. Let me come back to you, Marco. So you, again, extensive report. You've got some solutions here, how to get there. 4 points about addressing inflation, the fiscal structures, private investment, focusing on the poor. Can you, I guess, give a quick summary of that 4-point plan on how to get there?
Sure. So if we see the next 3 to 6 months, what we believe is critical is to reduce inflation and do so in a way that you address the fiscal pressures, you catalyze investment, and you protect the poor. Now, for inflation, one area that we have highlighted, not just in this report, but in previous editions, it's the importance of exchange rate management. More flexible, more predictable exchange rate management that makes FX availability wider across the board could help to attract and retain the private investment that Nigeria needs, but also it will help to bring down the parallel market rate, which in our view has been one of the drivers of inflation. Conjunctions to exchange rate reform is also the opportunity that Nigeria has to remove some of the foreign exchange restrictions, especially on imported food and key staples, because we have been seeing that inflation has been largely driven by food prices. On the fiscal side, a key element is the elimination of the PMS subsidy, which we have already discussed. In addition to that, the opportunity to boost non-oil revenues, to be less dependent on that oil factor that we have been highlighting. And one critical area here to highlight is the opportunity to raise excise taxes, especially on what we call the sin goods, with the alcohol, tobacco, cigarettes, sugary drinks, and so forth. This could have a progressive effect on the economy and also bring significant resources. And to catalyze investment, just to highlight the opportunity also that Nigeria has to continue to push ahead the power sector reform agenda. Power is the oxygen of the economy, and without it, it will be very difficult to attract that investment. And that could be combined with measures to improve connectivity, for example, to harmonize procedures at the border so that people don't have to spend too much time in customs. And the protection of the poor is what brings everything together. People are suffering and struggling, they're going hungry. So it is critical to make sure that there is conditional cash transfer programs that support the poor and vulnerable during this very difficult time.
Thank you so much. Shubham, I want to ask, how practical is it to be able to implement these reforms in a pre-election year? Because, I mean, as you both know, there's a big election coming up, 2023. The last year before an election, generally, you don't tend to see much movement on reforms because the country seems so distracted with reforms. Or is this report more so even for the new government coming in? Is it a continuum as far as the solutions you've put in here?
I think, look, pre-election years are always difficult to get a political consensus. And certainly, there's a sense that, some people are saying that, look, we just need to kind of get beyond the elections, then we can take on a lot of these things, because there's too much, building a consensus will be difficult. I think what we're trying to say is that Nigeria may not have the time for that. I mean, 2022 is going to be a very difficult year and could be a very difficult year in terms of the fiscal pressures in an environment where you have growing insecurity, a lack of jobs, economic opportunities. So you have the beginnings of potentially a vicious spiral, which can be addressed. It does require a consensus. And let me be clear, sometimes you hear saying, oh, the World Bank is insisting. No, we are never insisting. We're here to help Nigeria, help eliminate poverty, lift 100 million Nigerians out of poverty, make lives better. This is our frank assessment. You may not agree, but at least the one thing I would urge all your viewers to think about is the status quo acceptable? Because the status quo is not sustainable. So perhaps what we're suggesting in terms of PMS subsidy, taking away PMS subsidies, putting in a large-scale cash transfer, better FX management, maybe that's not a solution that Nigeria can move towards, but there needs to be some alternative then. I think if nothing else, if this report can just bring people to discuss and think about that the status quo right now cannot be sustained, and we may not have enough time to last beyond the elections in 2023. So hence the title of the report, Time for Business Unusual.
It makes complete sense, that title of the report. Thank you, Shubham. Marco, I want to come back to what you were saying about exploring taxation. Ghana made the news the last 24 hours in that the mobile money operators were pushing back on an e-tax, or rather a tax on electronic transactions, 1.75%. That's because as a result of their budget deficit from their 2022 budget presentation. There's also projections that in Ghana, fuel, and they have a deregulated downstream system in Ghana. They don't have any fuel subsidies like we do in Nigeria. But there was a projection that fuel prices would, hit a new high. And so there's a lot of pressure on the average Ghanaian due to taxes that the government needs for revenue. For Nigeria, with the suggestions you've put through in your very, thorough report here, is there room to do that, to look at, I guess, like the taxes on the same goods, as you mentioned, when you've got high inflation and people's pockets are being pressured as they are, which you've pointed out in your report? Is there room for any tax raises in this post-COVID period where countries like Nigeria are still struggling a bit fiscally?
We believe that there is a scope to consider several ways to boost revenues. Let me just start with a striking statistic. Nigeria, just before starting the COVID-19 pandemic, was the country with the lowest revenues in the world. It was ranked 115th out of 115 countries. As a result, it also was the second lowest. It also had the second lowest expenditures in the world, only higher than Haiti. So we're talking about a situation that was very dire just before entering the COVID pandemic, when the needs exploded as a result of trying to mitigate the impact of what was an unprecedented event. So if we're starting with that context, then we need to see what can be done in terms of boosting revenues without necessarily affecting private investment, or without necessarily impacting negatively on the opportunities that are required to push job creation. And let me just give you a few examples. On the one hand side is the opportunity to expand the base, and that expansion of the base could happen in two ways. It could happen through policy, or it could happen through better tax administration. I think there's a consensus of the need to continue to push on reforms to improve tax administration so that compliance of the taxes that currently exist is boosted, and that will result in additional revenues. And I think there are a range of things that could be done in that regard, including harmonization of procedures, better technology, and so forth. In addition to that, it's also important to think about what are specific taxes that could be considered that would not necessarily bring down investment or consumption at a time when Nigerians are still struggling. One option is to do excise taxation, which is the most progressive type of taxation because it focuses on specific products and it taxes those that consume those products. We're talking here about alcohol, tobacco, cigarette, sugary drinks, etc. Another option is also, for example, you highlighted the case of Ghana. In Nigeria, Nigeria has already adopted an electronic money transfer levy, but right now it's not fully benefiting. Exactly. It's not fully benefiting from that particular taxation because there is a need for pushing for regulations that would allow for that levy to be collected. So we do believe that there is that opportunity and could be accelerated to make it happen.
Great stuff. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back. Do stay tuned. Welcome back to the Arise Exchange. We still have our special guest from the World Bank. We've extended this conversation because it's so interesting. Great report from the World Bank, the latest one, Nigerian Development Update. Marco Hernandez, lead economist, was just talking about before the break the types of taxes that the Nigerian government can focus on with respect to raising revenue. Thank you for that, Marco. Shubham, I want to end with you very quickly. What if we say, as Nigeria, there's a consensus to live with exchange rate-induced inflation so as to return to local production and import substitution in the long run? Shubham, what do you think of that trade-off? Does that trade-off make sense? Can we live with that if we want to get to local production and import substitution to, I guess, reduce imports and the exchange rate pressure from there?
I think you have to ask yourselves whether exchange rate restrictions are going to actually bring that about. If the reason that the economy isn't diversifying is because there's no transport connectivity, or because there are certain intermediate inputs that are not available in the country, then FX restrictions, even when they're intended to be quite targeted, can have unintended spillover impacts. It's very hard to figure out which are the kinds of things that will actually contribute to the economic diversification agenda. And import substitution, or I would say export promotion as well, because Nigeria has tremendous potential for export promotion as well. So when we talk to firms and businesses, one often finds that they're domestic firms that were creating value in Nigeria, adding to the jobs, who are now finding that their growth prospects have to be put on hold because they don't have certainty about whether they will have access to the FX to bring in essential intermediate inputs. So no economy can be autarkic. Economies always, and that's part of the beauty of being part of a global economy with global supply chains and the growth in other countries. I worked for 15 years in Asia. The growth of Asian countries has come from their ability to plug into these global supply chains. If Nigeria has that same potential, especially in the context of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, and yet if domestic firms can't compete because they don't have access to essential inputs, because there are FX restrictions and it's not clear who gets FX for what, that is going to retard domestic value added. So our point is that there are domestic value added, increasing domestic value added is absolutely the top priority for Nigeria, because that's what's going to create jobs. But is FX restrictions the real source kind of solution, or the fact that you have imports coming in the problem, or are there other problems behind the border problems that can be addressed that would actually spark the full potential of the Nigerian private sector?
Great stuff. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your patience, for sticking around with us. It was a very important conversation. Shubham CHAUDHURI, Country Director, World Bank Nigeria, and Marco Hernandez, Lead Economist, World Bank Nigeria. Again, really in-depth report that we encourage everyone to take a look at. Nigerian Development Update, the latest from the World Bank. Gentlemen, thank you both so much.